Ladies and gentlemen, let us carry on. Many thanks for staying in here and not going away. Let me welcome here Ms. Sevgil Musaieva, the editor-in-chief of Ukrainska Pravda. And it's been said already that Professor Snyder will join us later for this discussion. What's your job?
Now to have a discussion with Professor Timothy Snyder, and
it doesn't
really
happen
ashamed.
too often.
Yes, yeah, of course. But you know, in the first days of war, I received a call from Professor Timothy Snyder. It was maybe 28 or the 1st of March, I remember. We had a discussion before the start of the war, maybe it was 20th of February in NPR. And then Timothy Snyder, it was absolutely unpredictable actually, because Timothy Snyder said, if you need any help, I can translate your articles, for example, if you need any help. So it's about unpredictable behavior of Timothy Snyder, who is a big friend of Ukraine. Of course, we asked him not to do that, but it was very emotional for me personally that I'm a big fan of him, and he said, I'm with you and with Ukrainian people. But what is my job? My job is telling the people the truth, actually. So, and the Ukrainska Pravda name means Ukrainian truth, and the truth matters, and this war actually shows how it's important.
So according to your experience, Mr. Snyder is quite unpredictable himself.
Yes, he is.
If I may ask now for the photograph, because yes. Sevgil Musaieva, we had a little chat beforehand, and she asked us to screen this photo over here, Faces of War. Why did you want us to show this photograph?
Yeah. When I travel abroad, people usually ask me, how do you feel, how you, Ukrainian people, feel about living at war? And I decided to show this picture, this photo. It was taken 20th of March this year. This is a ceremony, actually. This year, we first in our history, in history of Ukrainska Pravda, decided to celebrate Ukrainian women leadership. And here you see 3 women, brave Ukrainian women, in the ranks of Ukrainian army. Actually, there are 70,000 Ukrainian women now in Ukrainian army. You can imagine this is the largest number among all armies of NATO countries. 3 of them. Irina Tsibuch, she is 25. The second one, girl, is Oksana Rubanyak. She is 24. And Anastasia Savka, she is 27. It was 20th of March, and now is the midsummer, 15th of July. Irina Tsibuch died. This girl who is sitting here. She was wounded in the front line, and she died. I personally know her mother. It's very difficult, and it's about grief all Ukrainians live in such difficult times. It's about losing, it's about our casualties, it's about the best people, because she was a journalist. She was a young producer in our Suspilne channel. The second girl, who is Oksana Rubanyak, a few months ago, she asked me personally, could you help us to fundraise money for a drone? We need a drone for our unit, for our military unit. And actually, this is not my job. I'm a journalist. I need to provide an information for people. But that time, I said, okay. And we created this fundraising company. And in a few days, our readers donated 1 million hryvnias, which around 500,000 Czech crowns. And it helped her. And the third photo, you see Anastasia Savka with amputated leg. At the same time, when the same day actually, it was in the next day, after funeral of Irina Tsibuch, she posted a photo that a man also with amputated leg proposed to her, and she agreed. And they will definitely have a wedding in a few months. And this is about life and joy, even in times of very terrible war, even in times of casualties. And this is just one photo that was taken. And the most saddest part for me as a journalist is that I can tell you all the stories I heard those 2.5 years of this war, because there are thousands of casualties, and I try my best, but I will never succeed with it.
Mr. Snyder, we invited you to join this discussion with a Ukrainian journalist. How important actually is the job of journalists in this war, and namely in Ukraine?
Well, if I could, I would start with a much broader point, which is that we can't function as free societies, even in the best of times, without the journalists. One of the illusions of, I think, our tradition of talking about freedom is the notion that the truth automatically rises to the top. It's an idea that you can find discussed in the kinds of people that Milan Babik says he now no longer reads. We have this notion of a free market of ideas. You say something, and somehow the truth comes up. And this is simply not true, and it's never been true, and it's much less true now than it was 20 years ago, because now fewer people control more of the media, and the job of investigative journalist is in danger. And the reason why the investigative journalists, the reporters, are important, whether they're covering war or whether they're covering water pollution in Moravia, is that facts don't grow naturally from the ground. People have to go hunt them down, and they're always taking some risk. Even that water pollution reporter in Moravia is taking some risk because there's a company somewhere that doesn't want you to know about the water pollution. And of course, war reporters are taking even greater risk. But the facts don't come around automatically. In my country, we're down to a couple thousand reporters totally, and that's part of a larger problem. So I realize this problem, general problem, on the very sharp example of Ukrainian, and I should say also in fairness, Russian war reporters in 2014, that I realized that if there weren't a few people, and a disproportionate number of them happen to be women, but if there weren't a few people who were actually going to the front and writing about what was happening in February, March, April, May of 2014, we simply wouldn't know. There would be no record. We would have no way of knowing. And so in the Road to Unfreedom, which the minister was kind enough to mention, I dedicated it to the reporters because they're as the heroes of our time. And I deeply believe that. I think anyone who makes that choice to take on that profession is making things possible for the rest of us, which otherwise wouldn't be possible.
Ms. Musaieva, how difficult is it to be a journalist today in Ukraine? And I mean, especially apart from the obvious, that you live in constant danger, that you very often don't get enough sleep because there are, am I right?
All Ukrainians now don't have enough sleep because of warlords.
That's what I mean. Mm-hmm. But from the journalistic professional point of view, what's the most difficult task?
Before 2022, before February 2022, I thought that I'm a representative of profession which is almost to die, like we don't need a journalism, and I have to think about something else, maybe in a few years. But then, when the war started, and the war is all the time is about honest answers for yourself, and it's about choices you make every day. And for journalists, it's every single moment, I will say. And I understood the importance of journalism. I understood the importance of news in the first days of invasion, when people were not ready to go to the bed without reading the news. There was millions of, in the first days of invasion, actually, we had 7.5 million unique visitors in our website. And they were searching for the news because it was about saving the lives. It literally was about saving the lives. I remember how I went to the village, which was deoccupied by Ukrainian forces in the beginning of April. And I met a woman, and she cried, and she said that the most difficult for her when she was in occupation was not being without food or without water. The most difficult thing for her was being without news, because she didn't know who controls the village, how actually green corridors will be organized. Is it actually a chance for her to save her life? And when you feel that, I remember how actually our videographer was captured in his village, and in 10 days, I didn't know is he alive or not, and then in 10 days, he texted me, I'm alive, I escaped the occupation, and I cried because it was the first good news from the beginning of invasion, that he's alive. And you know, I heard the thousands of stories of people who escaped the occupation, and what they wrote to their relatives and natives. And believe me, there were no messages about NATO, about mask. There were like simple messages. I'm alive, are you okay? And this is about also journalism during these times of war.
That's the war reporting. And what about the more traditional journalism, which is supposed to work as watchdogs of democracy and to hold the powerful account? If I may put it very simply, is it allowed for a journalist in Ukraine to be critical of, let's say, President Zelensky?
We don't ask, actually. We do. Actually, you know, in the first days of invasion, the first months of invasion, it was about definitely solidarity with your state, with your government, with your people. And actually, we focused more on covering Russian war crimes and covering, first of all, war crimes that Russia committed in Ukraine. I remember how actually we found the assets of Russian oligarchs in a few days, and how in next few days, thanks with help of ambassadors who called me, could you please translate all these yachts you published in your website? All these yachts were arrested. This is about positive impact of the journalism during the war. Answering your question about how we cover our own government, we do criticize the government. We publish anti-corruption investigation too. And actually we had a discussion inside the teams, we had a discussion inside our media landscape, is it the good time or is it the bad time? And we understood that maybe this is the right time, and this is about responsibility we feel with our readers. Because if, for example, after the end of this war, people of Ukraine will acknowledge when they paid this very difficult price, very high price for the right to be independent, for the right to be democratic states, someone used kind of schemes, corruption. It will be unfair for our soldiers, it will be unfair with our people. And it will be our responsibility that people didn't know. And actually, when we started to publish the first investigation in autumn 2022, and the first investigation was published about some misconducts with procurement, it was January 2023, a lot of soldiers, a lot of people who in the front line were grateful for us, because for them it was important.
Mr. Snyder, how important is it to talk about the quality of democracy in Ukraine today, to be critical of the government, even though the government and the president are fighting the aggression? So how important is it?
I mean, taking up where Sevgil left off, it's the people who are fighting aggression in Ukraine are the frontline soldiers, the other members of the Ukrainian armed forces, the territorial defense, and their families and their friends, and the hundreds and hundreds of tiny non-governmental organizations that are keeping them supplied. And I would say the journalists who are, not that they're directly fighting a war, but the journalists create the conditions in which certain things are possible. So that's how I'm answering your question. It's not that you have the good journalists and the bad corrupt politicians. It's not as simple as that. It's that in order to have a democratic, pluralistic civil society that's fighting a war, you have to have a whole lot of things going on at the same time, an awful lot of cooperation and an awful lot of trust. And I mean, one of the ways that this war is being fought is that different people who may not know each other are able to send things to the front because they have a friend in common or something. And so supplies will get sent from one part of Ukraine to another on these networks of trust. Right? And so the trust is very important, and it's a positive thing. It's not just an absence, right? So I mean, I'm answering your question, but I think it's very important to stress that this war, the Ukrainians have been able to defend themselves for so long because of various kinds of small-scale networks. And so the image that there are a few heroic journalists and it's their job to criticize, a few politicians wouldn't be right. But of course, it's important that that politicians are held to standards. I would just put that in the context of all of the other things that have to happen so that you can have the trust which is necessary to carry out this kind of endeavor.
Sevgil, you wanted to add something, I believe.
I want to add that, first of all, we have to continue our democratic transformation because it has started in 2004. I remember I was 17 years old student of Institute of Journalism, and it was the beginning of Orange Revolution. And as a student, as a future journalist, I joined people in the Maidan. The same happened in 2014. And Mr. Professor Timothy Snyder is absolutely right that it's about networks that actually Ukrainians are effective in this war. And I think that this war actually our third and most important Maidan in the history, in the modern history, because we are fighting for the right of our country to exist, but not only to exist, but to be a democratic, transparent, and European state. That's why even in times of war, it's important to save this democratic path of development. It's important to save institutions, to save civil society, and of course, it's important to criticize the misconduct of the government, bad governance, and lack of leadership. So that's why this is about the positive changes during the war.
Yes, please.
Just a constructive suggestion for people beyond Ukraine. It's of course very important to track down and try to stop corruption inside the government. But if one wants to make a positive difference, an approach that is consistent with this history of Maidan that Sevgil is mentioning is to actively support Ukrainian civil society organizations. So one thing I worry about with Western policymaking is that we always do things on a state-to-state basis. That's the habit, that's the easiest way to do things. But if one recognizes that democracy itself in Ukraine has largely been a matter of civil society acting, putting pressure upwards, and one realizes that the success of Ukrainian warfighting has also largely been a matter of civil society pushing outwards against an invasion, then you could draw the conclusion, aha, okay, I'll criticize the state, but I will recognize the positive particularity of Ukraine, which is that there are thousands of little groups out there which with a little effort I could probably support. And that is also, by the way, an anti-corruption measure, because if you keep the little civil society groups going, they will do a better job of handling corruption than we can from Brussels or Berlin or Washington.
Why is it so important for Europe and maybe the rest of the world? What will actually happen to Ukraine, including the question whether it will become a democratic country? Why does it matter so much to Europe, Mr. Snyder?
I mean, I'm going to answer that, but before I do, I just want to say that there's, before one makes big arguments about interests, I think one should start with certain arguments about humanity. We really ought to be able to empathize with people under occupation. We really ought to be able to care about tens of thousands of children being deported and assimilated. We ought to be able to do that as humans, even if we don't know that that's, legally speaking, genocide. We ought to be able to think about what it's like for big European cities like Kharkiv to be attacked almost every day, or for big European cities like Mariupol to be completely wiped off the face of the earth. I think that honestly should be enough. If not for us Americans, at least for you Europeans who are so much closer, like that, I really think that should be enough. That should be enough. Now, there are other arguments to make, and I'll make them, but I really feel like that should be enough. It's close to you. You have the economic power to make the difference. The scale of human suffering is extraordinary. You can do a lot more to stop it. That should be enough. But I will answer it in terms of interests. There are the European order in which you all live is based in general on the legal principle that sovereign states have borders which shouldn't be violated. Russia is violating Ukrainians' border and claiming to annex its territory, thereby directly attacking that principle of international law which has benefited Europeans more than anyone else. And Europeans, starting from that principle of state sovereignty and borders, have built a new kind of order, the European Union, based on the idea that sovereign states can cooperate. This is a post-imperial order, the one and only that we have in the world right now, a post-imperial order. Russia is directly attacking that. Russia is not only attacking Ukraine, it's attacking Europe in the sense that it's saying, we are still in an imperial world. In Russian foreign policy documents, the European Union is treated as an aberration and as a temporary state of affairs which will soon end, on the logic that what really matters historically and therefore in the future is empires. That's what they have in mind for you, and very specifically, they mean for the European Union to come to an end. China, that's where everyone thought the next world war was going to be until Russia invaded Ukraine. The Ukrainians, by holding off Russia, are deterring China in a way that no one else can do. The Americans can't do it because anything we do with respect to China can be read as provocative. But the Ukrainians, simply by defending themselves, show how hard offensive operations are. A big war in China would be very bad for you. Nuclear proliferation. European countries are already talking very seriously about building nuclear weapons, and not only European countries. And the reason why they're doing this is that Russia, a nuclear power, might defeat Ukraine, a non-nuclear power. If we allow a nuclear power to just overwhelm a non-nuclear power, while it's constantly issuing threats of the use of nuclear weapons, we are then creating a world in which medium-sized countries in Europe and in Asia will believe they have to build nuclear weapons in order to defend themselves, and that's a world in which nuclear war is much more likely. So there are many, many reasons why Europeans and the rest of us should care about Ukraine, many powerful reasons. And one way to think about this is that by continuing to fight, Ukraine is holding off all those futures that I just described. We are here in a Europe that still functions, in which the rule of law more or less functions, in which there is no war in the Pacific, in which there hasn't been nuclear proliferation yet, because the Ukrainians are pushing it all back, they're holding it all back right now, this timeline that we are on is possible because of them. If we let them go, we can all shift to a very, very different world very quickly.
Ms. Musaieva, I've noticed you nodding in agreement a couple of times. What would be your answer to the question, how important actually is this war for the rest of the world?
Today is 15th of July, and this is actually a holiday in Ukraine, the day of Ukrainian statehood, which is also a day of baptism of Kievan Rus Ukraine, and it marks thousands of years of Ukraine's history. So, answering your question, first of all, this war about recognizing our state, about protecting our state. This is right, but this is only one layer of this war. Just the fight for our right to exist as a country, as a state, and as a nation. The second layer is, of course, about the world we live in. And this is war between two systems, autocracy and democracy. This is right. And I just want to mention, and maybe just you to imagine the world if Russia, for example, prevail in Ukraine. What it will mean for the world. It will mean that probably the bigger state could invade smaller states, or it means that someone could blackmail with nuclear weapons the rest of the world. This is true. And this is not about borders. This is not about borders. You know, I'm Crimean Tatar. My native land was occupied in 2014. Last time I was in Crimea was 10 years ago, 21st of July. I remember that day. Of course, I dream day and night to come back to my native land. Of course, because I'm the fourth generation of Crimean Tatars who forced to leave their native land. And probably it will not happen tomorrow. And when all politicians, when all historians, when all ask me, but do you believe that Crimea could be returned by Ukraine? Is it about fighting for Crimea? It's difficult for me. I know that moral dilemma. And of course, I dream about coming back. Of course, I dream about raising my children in the occupied and free Crimea. But at the same time, I understand that how many Ukrainians could die. But this is not about borders, and war is not about borders 1991. This is war definitely about borders inside our heads and about freedom inside our heads. And red lines inside our heads. Of course, a lot of people think that it's impossible to defeat Russia in Ukraine. A lot of. We see kind of a terrible situation in a battlefield. We don't have a lack of people, lack of ammunition, and actually thanks for your leadership in that question. And this is important for us. And I know how it worked in the front line because a lot of my friends in the front line. And compared to the situation that we had a few months ago, now it's much better in terms of ammunition, first of all. But there are other ways how we can win this war. And it's also about crossing the borders inside our heads, crossing the red lines inside our heads, thinking to feel unpredictable about the things. That we can defeat Russia, for example, in an economic way. And it's possible. It's not about war. It's about rules. It's about creating the new order. I mean, first of all, I don't want us to be rational. And when we think rational, of course, in our heads, it's impossible to defeat Russia. But when we think irrational about it, when we think that probably we can stop trading with Russia, for example, we can think about sanctions. Yes, sanctions are working, and Russian economy is struggling, but it's not enough. And the way how to win this war, this is in different ways, in a military way, but first of all, in economic way. And this is a main goal for all the world. Because who will feel free. Of course, for example, tomorrow we can imagine the situation. Ukraine decided to have a ceasefire. You remember what happened with Chechnya after, for example, they stopped the first Chechnya war. Russia came in few years. It will be the same, believe me. I know what I'm talking about. I was raised in Crimea, and now some of my classmates fight against Ukraine in the ranks of Russian army. I grew up with those kids. It is possible that tomorrow, if, for example, the part of Ukraine will be occupied, there will be some more Ukrainians who will be fighting in the ranks of Russian army. Believe me, it will happen. 10 days passed from the occupation of Crimea. And I see these people, I see my classmates who are fighting against Ukraine. How do you think I feel myself? I feel terrible about that. Yeah.
When you've mentioned Crimea, let me ask a specific question, because there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of it not very well informed, to put it mildly, on social media, whether Crimea actually was truly Ukrainian from the historical point of view. You probably know what I mean. Was it like historically really Ukrainian, or was it actually Russian all the time? So how do you feel about that?
What I know definitely that all my grandmothers were buried in Crimea, and I can show you all the tombs of my grand ancestors in Crimea. This is about, is it Russian or is it not Russian? Crimeans were deported in 1944, but they also forced to leave earlier in the 18th century with the first annexation of Crimea, which happened, I just will acknowledge you, in 1784 with signing Kuchuk Energy Agreement, or 1776 first of all, and the second 1786. But now I don't want to have this discussion about Crimean Tatar, Russian Crimea, or Ukrainian Crimea. I just want you to think about protecting the international borders and about protecting international law and about the borders of 1991, which we had, and we also had a Budapest Memorandum that actually believed us that our borders will be protected by the Allies, and it was signed in 1994. So, and this was a deal. So, and so tomorrow another one state could also change the borders of other states, which if we allow Russia to do so in Crimea, with the discussion, is it more Ukrainian or is it more Russian, or how many Ukrainians, Russians live there in the beginning of Ukrainian independence. My parents returned to Crimea in 1990, and in 1991 they voted for the independence of Ukraine, and around 60% of Crimeans voted for independence of Ukraine too. This is also the answer for your question.
Mr. Snyder, there are voices that argue that Ukraine will eventually have to agree to some compromise to end the war. Can you imagine such compromise? What may it look like?
I think it's improper for us to lead that conversation in the English language from Prague. I think it's very important to listen to where the Ukrainians are and to work from there. I think it's also very important to recognize that pretty much everybody who's made predictions about this war, not everybody, but pretty much everybody has been wrong. And if you look at where we were at any given point, like if you look at the consensus at any given point, that consensus has generally turned out to be wrong about what was going to happen next. I personally think that the Russian state is in a much worse position than people generally realize. And I understand war in the Clausewitzian sense, that is to say, it has to do with politics and whether politically your system can keep going. And that goes in a way back to the journalism question. I think one of the strengths of the Ukrainian system is that it is possible to have critical views and express them, and for that actually to lead to change during the war itself, which is not really possible in Russia. Mistakes will be made and there will be purges and so on, but that kind of conversation is not possible in Russia. And that's one of the many weaknesses of the Russian state in this conflict. So I will listen, like, on a lot of things. I mean, I've been going to Ukraine for 30 years, and Ukrainians have changed their views on a lot of issues over time. And I've tried to just pay attention to what that has been, because it seems to me that that's what's really significant. I am going to make a point about Crimea, though, which is different. I mean, as a historian, I've tried very hard to be quiet while you asked the question about, like, Crimean history, and I'm going to continue to be quiet about that unless you ask me. But because it's so interesting, I'll take up the rest of the evening. But I do want to make a strategic point about Crimea. I'll make it a historical point. For the past 2,500 years, and I mean this quite literally, from the time of the ancient Greeks and their contact with Scythia, through the 19th and 20th centuries, the Crimean War, the Second World War, everybody who has had any serious contact with this region understood that critical to the existence of a political unit are the three rivers, the Don, the three major rivers where they reach the Black Sea, the Don, the Dnipro, and the Danube. And we, in the present, we tend to have we're a very psychological culture now. We wake up in the morning, we ask ourselves, we don't ask ourselves, what are the major Ukrainian rivers that lead to the sea? We don't. People did for 2,450 years, but for the last 50, we don't. We wake up in the morning, we ask ourselves, how is Putin feeling today? And that's not actually the right way to think about how wars end. And so while I'm not going to answer your question directly about compromise, I'm just going to note that a lot of the way we talk about compromise and so on has to do with how we feel and how we feel Putin feels. And I would say whether this war comes to an end durably, because of course you can always stop fighting for a moment, as Sevgil says, but then there may be another moment. For it to fight endurably, the Ukrainian state's going to have to control, if not all of those waterways, at least two of them, and the third one shouldn't have a bridge attached to it.
Sevgil, what do you think of those Europeans, and some of them are politicians, who go and say that you, Ukrainians, should try to achieve some ceasefire, and in order to achieve that, you should give up some land? How cheeky is that?
My answer is that occupation is another form of the war. And I know what I'm talking about. I know how, because I have relatives in Crimea, and how they feel about the things. They actually avoid even to have any conversation with me, just to save their lives, because for them it's very dangerous. A few days ago, I met with Nariman Jalal, who is deputy head of Majlis, and he spent in Russian prison 2 years, 10 months, and 10 days. He was released successfully by Ukrainian side. But he was accused of terrorism 3 years ago after participating in Crimean platform. And how many people in occupied territories, I mean, Ukrainians could be prosecuted by Russians, you can imagine. We don't have exactly number of people who now in the prison, I mean, among civilians. We know a number of political prisoners in the prisons, but we don't exactly number. Human rights defenders says that there are around 20,000 to 50,000 people who now in the jails, and they are civilians. and we don't have any mechanism to help them and to release them right now. And you see what Russia actually committed in occupied territories after the liberation of Izium and other villages of Ukraine. They left mass graves, they left destroyed cities, they left destroyed lives of people. And this is not about one generation or two generations. This impact will stay with Ukraine years and years and have. So, I don't want to discuss that question about ceasefire and about that Ukraine have to give up the territories, because one more time, the occupation is another form of the war. The occupation, you Czech people definitely know what I'm talking about, what happened with your country in 1968. This is about occupation. This is about no freedom, no rights. This is about fear you feel every single day. And when you speak with people in occupied territories, the first emotion you read is about fear. And this is not about living your normal life. That's why, of course, we Ukrainians dream about returning the borders. But one more time, the goal of this war and the victory of Ukraine is not only about borders. And I mean, for us, it means, of course, returning to the borders of 1991. But for the modern world, the victory of Ukraine means that nobody could blackmail the whole world with the nuclear weapons. Nobody could change the territories, the borders of other states. And nobody could blackmail with using a power smaller states.
Professor Snyder, when you said a couple of minutes ago that you believe that Russia is actually in a worse state than is generally believed, what exactly do you mean?
So there are some patterns that you observe in the history of war. One is that people think a war is going to be short, and then it turns out to be long. And another is that people start wars with one rationale, and then they move on to other rationales. And these are very general historical patterns. They apply not only to Russia, but eventually you get to the next state where your rationale has changed so many times that it's not clear even to you what you're doing. And I'm sure the rest of you don't watch Russian propaganda television as much as I do, and you're the healthier for it, I'm sure.
You don't know who's in the audience.
But, well, there may be a couple of you out there. But they are starting to lose their story. They're improvising in a way which they haven't really been before. I mean, it was crazy in the beginning, but it was crazy in a somewhat organized way, right? I don't even like to repeat their propaganda tropes, but they had some organized stories that they were telling. That's one thing. Another thing is that they're simply not doing very well on the battlefield. So they did take some villages in the Donbass, but they've lost tens of thousands of men in order to not take any territory in Kharkiv Oblast. They just basically did a Vietnam War. I mean, they basically lost the same number of troops that the United States lost in Vietnam in order to not take any territory in Kharkiv. I don't think that can go on indefinitely, and it's not just the numbers, it's also where the soldiers are coming from. So Sevgil Musaieva mentions a very painful thing, which is the press ganging of Ukrainian citizens into the army. At the beginning of the war, there was an awful lot of that. an awful lot of, it's terrible, but a very large number of Ukrainian citizens were killed fighting in the Russian army. And they moved from there to national minorities in Russia, which is relevant to those of you who are wondering whether Russia's an empire or not. Asian national minorities were disproportionately killed in the next 6 or 9 months in the war in Ukraine. And then from there, roughly speaking, to the impoverished provinces in general. It's only now getting to the point where the sons of middle classes or urban people are being sent, and that's also, I think, politically, that starts to become politically meaningful. And then also the Russian economy. The prices of hydrocarbons are down. They are, they're forced to negotiate with the Chinese from a position of weakness on the sale of commodities. They are not able to build certain things themselves, which they're going to need to keep prosecuting this war. And so those are the general things. But there's also there's a rule which I want to keep in mind, which is that we have reporters in Ukraine. We know when things go wrong in Ukraine, right? We have a superabundance of information from Ukraine. In fact, we have very, very little information in Russia. And so when the Ukrainians knock out oil refinery after oil refinery, that may not even be reported, let alone what that means for Russian public opinion. So I also, in addition to those factors, I have the general view that probably there's more going on than we can see on the surface.
Ms. Musaieva, how closely do you actually follow or try to follow what's happening or might be happening in Russia? For example, whether the narrative of the propaganda has changed in any way or anything else. How much does it interest you actually? What's going on in Russia?
Professor Mr. Snyder is absolutely right that it's difficult to follow the news from Russia because we don't have an access to the territory. And I just want to mention even our freelance reporter who went to the occupied territory last year, Victoria Roshina, to cover war crimes in occupied territories, but she was also captured and now she's in Russian jail. This is about how Russia tries to do everything possible to avoid anyone, to inform people and to cover what is going on in occupied territories and, of course, in Russia. And all independent journalists forced to leave Russia last few years. At the same time, what I see from Russia propaganda relatives, they definitely dream about negotiation process right now. And I see the latest attacks on Ukraine and latest discussion on Ukraine question. They want to stop this war as soon as possible, of course, with all things they want, just to stop the war in borders and actually occupied territories they have already, without compensation, without contribution, without paying for everything, like just to have a ceasefire, and then maybe in a few years they will start another one. So I think that it will be it's dangerous period of war right now, and I hope that this plan will not work. And I think that even the last attack on children's hospital in Ukraine, this is a part of this plan. Just to ruin Ukraine's ability to fight and to destroy.
You have no doubts that it was deliberate, that it was not a mistake?
No, and maybe you all watched this video. It's very difficult to imagine that it was a mistake. No, I don't believe in that. And now this blackmail again, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, sorry, we don't have Ministry of Foreign Affairs, said that probably there will be some destruction of domes in near Kiev, which is also about blackmailing people, and they change all narratives that Ukraine should stop this war and we need a ceasefire. And what I see absolutely that they want to stop this war in their conditions and reasons.
And forgive me to ask a very blunt question, but what, in your opinion, are the Russians fighting for, actually?
Sorry?
Yeah, I know, I know. Why are the Russians in Ukraine? What do they want, really?
What Russians are fighting for? Interesting question. Maybe Professor Timothy Snyder will be the will answer. I think that they first. I think that they don't believe.
Never thought about that.
They
Why
don't
they actually attacked your country?
I mentioned in the first part of my answer that today is the day of Ukraine statehood. They are fighting against Ukraine as a state. They don't recognize Ukraine as a state. They recognize Ukraine as a part of empire, of Russian empire. They can't live without us, maybe. I don't know, like just...
Yeah, Mr. Snyder.
I mean, it has changed over time, but one does have to remember that at the beginning, this was a decision that was taken by one person who was consulting with a very small group. And we do know something about what that one person thought. That one person thought, and we know this because of his extensive historical publications, that one person believed that Ukraine and Russia were one nation. And what follows from that, as strategically or even operationally, is that you can win a war by immediately going to the capital and killing or kidnapping the elite. Because if you do that, the peasants are basically going to love you because, in fact, they're Russian. So their theory of victory was that the Ukrainian nation doesn't exist, that all the people who call themselves Ukrainians are, in fact, again, you name it. It depends on what kind of Russian nationalist or fascist you are. But all the people who say they're Ukrainians are, in fact, Poles or Jews or Europhiles or whatever it might be, but they're not really Ukrainian because there is no real Ukrainian. The real Ukrainians are the peasants and they really love Russia. And that turned out not to be true, as even they generally recognize. Or to put it in a darker way, on that theory of war, you have to keep killing more and more and more people because it turns out more and more people actually are Ukrainians. And I think that's the logic they've been following. And that Putin has been following, the propagandists have been following. But there's another level to this, which is that in addition to just stealing things, which for a lot of people is a motivation, there is with time, there's with time the idea that we can extract things from Ukraine, right? We can control the things in Ukraine that are valuable. So Prigozhin, who you may remember, Prigozhin, was about a year ago, he was a person of some interest. He said a few true things before he died, and one of them was that we had Ukraine divided up among the Russian oligarchs, right? This one was going to get this one was going to get this. So you can also see it in terms of old-fashioned colonialism, and I think that motive came in also with time. But with the population, I'm just going to link this a little bit to what I was saying before, I'm afraid it does happen that people who don't see any sense in a war can start to see a sense in war after they lose people they care about. So when your brother dies or your husband dies or your son dies, the war must have meaning. There must be a reason for it. You can't say what it is. And that's a logic of sacrifice, right? It's a logic of, it must mean something because I gave away something that mattered to me. And I think Russia is there. But this goes back to your earlier question. I don't think they're going to be able to stay there much longer. That logic that war is meaningful because we're dying works for a while, but it doesn't work indefinitely.
Did you want to add something?
Yes, I had a discussion with one opposition, a journalist from Russia who left the country many years ago, and he still has some connection with Russian people. And what he told me that actually a lot of people feel fear about what will happen with Russia after the collapse, after Russia lose this war. So, and that's why a lot of people decided maybe I have to support a Russian army, I have to support with even donating money because they're literally afraid what will happen after the collapse of Russia. So they're literally afraid what will happen next if Russia looted in Ukraine. So maybe now they are driven more by this feeling of fear to lose.
Mr. Snyder, when you are talking about this one person's decision in the very beginning, it seems there are politicians in the West who admire Vladimir Putin for some reason. Why do they do it? Okay, someone in particular in mind. You don't think there are any?
No, I just think I'm just trying to make you a little bit less diplomatic. Oh, here we are in Prague. Maybe there's a politician.
Yeah, there are some friendlier towards him than others.
Or, yes. No, indeed. So I tend to believe that in cases like this, one should start with one's own country. So I will talk about Donald Trump. So I think it has to do, and I'm going to echo something that Sevgil said earlier, I think it does have to do with worldviews. So for someone like Donald Trump, there is no rule-based system. That's a lie, that's a joke. He's gotten around it his whole life. And so he looks at someone like Putin, who seems to be able to get to evade the rule-based system and international order, and he says, well, that's a bigger gangster than I am. And therefore I admire that gangster. And I know you laugh, but I think that's fundamentally it. I mean, I think Trump, and of course if you're an American, it's humiliating, because the idea that your head of state would be admiring the Russian head of state when, you know, Russia, like, on a good day is Texas. That was for all you Texans out there. But it's humiliating to be, you know, to be a citizen of a country which actually does have some cultural and economic and military power, and then to have the head of your state say, "Oh, I admire this person who is, you know, not only just morally abhorrent, but also is just not that powerful, in fact," right? I mean, Trump makes Putin much more powerful than Putin would otherwise be, and if Trump were in power, he would make Russia much more powerful than Russia otherwise would be. But part of it is that it's a different worldview where you think might makes right, and then you admire the people who have gone further in that direction than you have otherwise. And then sometimes there are personal connections. I mean, Ann Applebaum has a really interesting book which just came out in English a few days ago, or is about to come out, called Autocracy Incorporated, which is about a kind of, it's about, she doesn't use this term, I don't think, but it's about a kind of, or maybe I did steal it from her, I'm not sure. Either I stole it from her, or she's about to steal it from me. A transactionalist international. So it's not that Tehran and Pyongyang and Moscow and Beijing have a common ideology, but they have a common interest in democracy not working anywhere because they don't want democracy to work at home. And that leads to these personal relationships where, for example, a Trump certainly knows he owes Putin something. Right? He knows that Putin helped him in 2016 and is helping him now, right? There are favors that are being traded. That's part of it as well. And one also shouldn't underestimate, and I talked about oligarchs for a reason in my lecture, one also just shouldn't underestimate sheer greed here. There are people who are helping other people to make money, or to start to make money. Yeah, that's a start.
I mean, you wrote in 2016, if Mr. Trump wins, Russia wins. Still true?
I mean, the main way that Russia can win is through us. The Russian economy is tiny compared to the European Union economy. The Russian economy is tiny compared to the American economy. There's no, it goes in a way back to all the defeatism questions about Ukraine. If Ukraine is backed by European and North American allies, really we should be asking not when Ukraine is going to lose, but when Russia is going to lose, because generally in the long term, at least when you get out to 4 or 5 years, it's going to be economic preponderance, especially manufacturing, and manufacturing which is converted to munitions, hint, hint, Europe. It's that which tends to win wars in the long run. So economically speaking, Ukraine really we should be asking, when is Ukraine going to win, rather than when is Ukraine going to lose. But the path to Russian victory, and they know this, is entirely through our politicians. That is not their plan B or plan C. That is their plan A. Their plan A is Trump. They're obsessed with Trump. Nasha Trumpushka. They're obsessed with Trump. No, I didn't make that up. That's what they call him. Every time an American politician shows up who looks like she or he will be doing Russia's work, they psychologically profile them, they find out what they can do for them, they promote them on their networks, etc. Trump's vice presidential candidate, sorry, he hasn't announced it yet. The senator the junior senator from Ohio, Mr. Vance, is a very good example of this, right? He says what Russia wants him to say on Ukraine and everything else, and then in turn, he gets promoted. They know their best hope is through us, and they're good at it. They're good at picking out people. They're good at finding weaknesses. They realize who's very cheap to purchase. They understand who has certain psychological weaknesses. They know how our political systems work, where the choke points are. They're good at making us not do the things that we should be able to do. And so, yes, of course, if Mr. Trump wins, it's going to be a win for Russia, not because anything will get done, but because going back to what I said at the end about how the state is so important, Russia will make America less functional. Trump will make America less functional, and that will be good for Russia. And of course, that will be very bad for Ukraine, but it will be bad in a lot of other ways as well.
Sevgil, I don't want you to comment on American politics.
Thank you.
I'd rather ask you about the future of Ukraine. How do you imagine your country after the war? What do you want it to be?
To be a part of European Union, and I have my personal image, which is to celebrate my maybe 50th anniversary near the Black Sea with my children and in a free Crimea. This is about my dreams, of course, but yeah, let us see what will happen next.
Sevgil Musaieva, Timothy Snyder, thank you very much.